All right. Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome you to, what is it now, week 5 of Summer Smasher, and our special guest speaker today for Storytelling Wednesday is none other than Dave Cole, who's actually one of the most interesting IIRs in the space. Not only is he a mentor to our team, but he also happens to be a team in the garage, kind of. It's weird. So it's been really interesting having him and his co-workers around the space, but then also him be such a really great resource to everybody. He walks really fast on this, like we would run into each other on the streets. You remember that back in the old time? You'd actually would be wearing very similar headsets like that. You're a very like speed walking type of guy. And my assumption is it's because you're always busy. You're a very busy person. Not just with all of the things that you do in your personal life, but also because of OpenRaven. But anyways, I'll let you introduce yourself at length. I'm super happy to have you here. Today's agenda, here, let me just put it up really fast so that we can quickly take a look at it. Did I do this right? Oh God, what are you guys seeing? Let me see. Is that it? Do you guys
tag cloud. A big old tag cloud.
Oh, that's not what I wanted. Oops, I jumped ahead. Here's the agenda. Okay, housekeeping. As usual, I offer an opportunity for students to bring up any problems you guys are having with Summer Smasher up until this point, with your projects, whatever. Usually you guys say nothing. I'm gonna wait a few seconds and see if anyone says anything. Does anyone need any help? All right. Number 2, the thought exercise word cloud review. So I wanted to really quickly show the question, which is why do product categories matter? This question was posed by Dave, and the answers that you guys came up with, again, I populated into a word cloud to see what kind of answers kind of visually stood out. Dave, do you see anything in here that sparks your interest when it comes to category, product categorization?
Oh, my human negativity bias goes straight to like the nastiest thing up there, which is knockoffs. Like, yeah.
Yeah. Knockoffs are a pain for companies. Yeah, so thanks again for everybody who participated. Everyone should be participating. But without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and kick it back to you, Dave, to tell us all about yourself and share your knowledge with us. We're so lucky to have you.
Cool. Well, thanks for all the kind words. I am first originally from Michigan. I moved to Los Angeles after falling in love with LA back in '96. I've always been in security. So I am the proverbial like inch wide, mile deep. So I've done things a little bit on the outskirts of security, really exotic stuff like backup, right? Kidding. But really like very focused, 25 years of security and 20 of that building products. So I run a podcast called Security Voices. If listening to my gravelly voice doesn't tire you after the next like 30, 45 minutes, there's more of it available. Unsurprisingly, it's about people in security. So we do some fun stuff in there on election security. Some of it that's probably not so fun for many people, but like things on encryption. Last one was the chief technology officer of RSA on encryption. We did one on robocalls and so forth. Long story short, I've been in security for a very long time. It's my passion. It's fun, and I'm actually my very last stint. I'm finishing up my time in security, and I recently was chief product officer at a company called Tenable, which went IPO. I took them through the IPO, and prior to that, I was at a company called CrowdStrike. where I was also their first chief product officer and got them through their kind of early uncomfortable days to the point where they were at clear sailing. And I was gone long before President Trump decided to drag them into election mayhem and so forth. If you're hearing that name and wondered why in God's name you know it, they ended up in a really weird situation where they were mentioned by the current president. So long story short, really long time in security, really long time in products. I started OpenRaven with a dear friend going back 20 years last April. We were funded by Upfront, who's biggest and best VC in LA. I am totally biased. We have a woman on our board named Karen Nortman, who's just an amazing person. And we built our platform. We launched it in February, right before the world fell apart, and quickly closed our Series A round of funding with Kleiner Perkins, so kind of blue chip Sand Hill Road VC. And right now, where the company is, we're about 20 people. Almost half of us are in LA. The rest of us are kind of up and down the West Coast, except for a few rare folks. And the goal of the company is to reinvent data security. So that's really kind of and we sell it to enterprises. We have a free entry point, so anybody could use it. They just have to ask nicely, and we give it to them. And the concept is we locate people's data. We allow them to know what data is where, and then we help them protect it, monitor and make sure that it's protected over time in order to avoid breaches. The big takeaway is people have lost control of their data, and that's why you see this steady parade of headlines, of data breaches and so forth. We think that sucks. We think that should not be, and we want to help stop it. And part of the way we do that is by making a free entry point to the product, which we think helps folks, and also it's a great way of growing our business too. So that's the really quick and dirty. I'm going to take you guys through a case study, which is really kind of OpenRaven in a lot of ways, and how I've decided on the product category there. And I'm going to take you literally up to my board meeting I had yesterday. The downside of having a startup CEO in to speak to you is I don't have a lot of time to prepare on stuff. The upside is everything I tell you is like up to the minute relevant stuff that I'm like working on right now or have worked on in the last 12 months. So, come along with the journey. I think the content is great. The preparation is more than likely hot garbage. So, come with a sense of humor. So the first thing is I want to convey to you how important product category is. And the way I want to explain it to you actually has a lot more to do with neuroscience than anything else. Has anybody here read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow? Anyone? No? Oh, all right. The book is painful, but it's one of the most important things I've ever read. And I think people building products and building companies need to understand. I've likened it to like eating a burrito full of oatmeal. It is that dense and occasionally that painful, but it's that nutritious too. It breaks down how people make decisions. And a category is all about interacting with people when they're making decisions about your product. Effectively, the thinking fast and slow kind of approach is your brain operates in two modes. It operates in really fast kind of gut decision mode. That's where you work most of the time. And then it also operates in your system two, which is your human big bad thinking part, your frontal lobe activities. And the gist of it is human beings, we don't really like to use our frontal lobe that much. We like to work off our guts. And there's a whole bunch of good science around this, whereas if you actually look at decisions making by judges, when they're fresh in the morning, they actually come up with really different decisions maybe than when they've had in the past when presented with different facts. As they get closer to lunch, what happens is they fall into that system one kind of doing things, the same things they did in the past. As they get back from lunch, they're more willing to engage and use the effortful kind of frontal lobe. The closer they get to quitting time, the more they tend to make decisions like they did in the past. And I propose to you that everyone's like this. It's part of the human condition. So one of the reasons, the way this ties back to product categories, is unless you really get someone to engage and think about your product, which is hard to do, they're gonna put you into a bucket that fits something they're already aware of. And there's not much you can do about it. So knowing your product category and digging into it is really about what space do you claim in another person's head? Because you can't count on them thinking deeply about what you're doing, because thinking deeply is hard and people don't enjoy it. And, kind of fun fact, when you're thinking hard, your pupils actually dilate. And they can even watch people in the book. They run studies, and you can see when someone starts thinking hard in a math problem because their pupils dilate. It's this amazing signal, and it's hard, and you only have so much of it. So the concept is picking a product category and being incredibly intentional about the product category means you understand what slot you're going to occupy in someone's head, which means you know how they're going to frame your product, how you're going to tilt your messaging, how you're going to build your features, what job you're doing for them in their head, and a whole host of other things. It's incredibly important. And I'm going to give you examples, because the interesting thing about it is there's really only 3 or 4 ways that you can approach a product category. So the first one is you play in an existing category. So I'll give you an example. And having spent like multiple decades in product, I've worked in nearly like one of all of these. So I'm going to pepper in mostly security examples and stuff that I did. So the first way to approach a category is you look at it and say, aha, antivirus. I ran Norton Antivirus for about half a decade. And there, what we were trying to do is the product had gotten fat and slow and kind of painful to work with. And there we said, we're going to stay in the same category, but we're going to make our stuff light and fast. We're going to build a better mousetrap. So the first way you can approach a category is the person has a slot in their head for antivirus. I am going to make a better mousetrap. There are a ton of advantages to this. Everything from you don't have to spend that much on marketing to, you have to get above the noise. But if you come up with a compelling message, people are going to immediately get it. You don't have to put a bunch of effort into it. People already have a budget for it. They're kind of used to spending on it. Playing in an existing category and building a better mousetrap, honestly, particularly if it's your first time building a product, is not a bad way to go at all. Secondly, the second category strategy is you can extend a category or kind of expand it a little bit. So the first product we ever built was something we originally called FoundScan, and we eventually called Foundstone Enterprise. But the concept was this: people had started scanning their environment for vulnerabilities, and they did it kind of periodically. They did it once a month, once a quarter, but the vulnerabilities were coming out all the time, and people were starting to get hacked left, right, and center. This is back in the early 2000s. And what we noticed is that people were treating scanning their environment and understanding their vulnerabilities a little bit like going to the dentist. Imagine if you didn't floss in between going to the dentist. Disaster. You end up with not so great report cards. What we were convincing people was there's this extra extension of scanning that's actually not vulnerability scanning, it's vulnerability management. And the analogy we used is like, yes, you're used to going to the dentist, you needed that, but you also need to brush and floss in between. And what that did is it made it more of an enterprise process and so forth, but it wasn't new. We were just saying this category is actually bigger than just point and shoot one time knowing what's out there. You have to know what your vulnerabilities are all the time. And that played out to be true. And there was a bunch more companies in it. The advantage of that is someone already has a budget and they know what it is, but you can push them past it. And you can usually lift your prices a little bit as you go. But you're tapping into a need, and you're saying that your need is bigger or a little different than maybe you thought it was. The third type of way you can approach a category is by refreshing and reinventing it. Now, this is what CrowdStrike did. CrowdStrike's a big, successful company that IPO'd last year. But we started basically by saying this category of endpoint security, where antivirus has kind of been the mainstay, we built it for stopping malware. The biggest problem today is not automated malware and spyware. It's nation state adversaries. It's Russia, it's Iran, it's China, it's the US. It's determined human beings trying to hack into an environment. The fancy word for that was advanced persistent threat, which was a nice way of saying a human is hacking you instead of an automated attack. So we looked at it and said, we want to win this endpoint security category, which includes antivirus, but we don't want to go head on with Symantec and McAfee. What we want to do is introduce something that's an adjunct to it, that's helpful and extra. And then once we get our spot with that customer, we're just going to kind of elbow out the other guys. And that basically, that premise worked out magically. Symantec and McAfee, who were formidable when we started, basically descended into crapitude, which is a technical term if you're wondering. And, basically CrowdStrike kind of ran the tables on the market. It was hard, but what we did is we started with something that was a category extension, which we convinced people that they kind of needed, that refreshed the category, and people started paying attention to the category. When I went into it, people were like, oh, who needs more endpoint security? This stuff sucks and it's boring. All of a sudden we got their attention by saying, oh, no. Here's what it looks like when you try and stop a human versus just this automated kind of malware. And then CrowdStrike came back later and said, how about you just give us the rest of your business and we throw out the bums? And it worked really, really well. What they did is they said, you have an endpoint security budget. We'll just take a little bit of it. And they took that little bit because it was new and interesting and different. And the other guys didn't have it. And then they just elbowed them out completely and are in the process of taking the whole market. The nice thing about that is there's a budget. The need's a little different. It's not as easy as just saying we're going to expand this thing that's there. But having said that, it isn't what the fourth category is, which is creating an entirely new category of product. Creating an entirely new category of product, particularly in this day when it's so easy to build products and technology, is actually pretty hard. Does anybody have any kind of ready-made examples of a brand new category of product? Like the one I could come up with that I think is probably justifiable is like what's happening in fitness now with Peloton. I think that's probably a completely different category than an exercise bike, given that it's internet connected and the need it's satisfying is connecting with another person for fitness, much more so than just being a bike. Anybody have any good examples of entirely new product categories?
So one that comes to mind is those scooters like Bird or and then LimeWire or whatever. I think LimeWire was actually where you downloaded legally music. I don't know.
Yeah.
Those I'd never seen anything like that before, and then they were so ubiquitous and everywhere.
Yeah. Steve just sent one across that it's actually a pretty good example. Social audio. I'll say Alexa, Google Home. Something you didn't know you needed before. That's a pretty good example. I'll say that of the strategies of playing an existing category, kind of extending a category, refreshing, revitalizing a category, and creating a new category. Creating a new category is the most exciting, but it's also the most highest risk. It requires the biggest marketing investment. It is really freaking hard. And most people who build products for a long time avoid it like the plague because it is so hard. And it's so speculative and so risk driven. And it's actually even hard to kind of get investment when you're saying, I've got this brand new thing. You're almost better at that point if you can just self-fund it, honestly, because the investors are going to bring so much skepticism to it. No matter how sexy you make it, it's just laden with risk. So, Hyperloop is a really extreme example of a whole new category, right? So those are the four strategies. And those are all very academic. I'll pause here for any questions. What I want to take you through is outside of the academic, I'm going to take you through what I've done for OpenRaven and how I've adapted to it. And I'm going to take you into the diary of a madman over here and show you my writing and kind of how I'm thinking about it. I'll even show you how I positioned it with the board and the board conversation. But before I do that, any questions?
I guess I have one question. When it comes to funding and fundraising, when you're talking about securities, do you get a lot more interest from the government and government money versus other industries? of kind of like tech entrepreneurship? Is that like a strategic way to think about getting into becoming an entrepreneur, is getting government funds?
Yeah, the problem with the government money is exactly what you'd think. And security is there's a few ways to do it. And ironically, my very next meeting, is with the Defense Innovation Unit, where they've actually created a think tank in order to thoughtfully bring startups into the DoD. But classically, there's a few ways of kind of doing it, and none of them are fun. Almost every security company goes to government contracts later in their life. And the first reason is they require a lot more certifications. They require you to have a level of maturity, and they move very, very slow. It might be 12 to 24 months and so forth before you can actually get a sale through. And that'll kill a startup. It'll absolutely kill you. By the time they're ready to purchase, you'll probably have gone out of business and burned through your cash. The second thing is it can make it harder for other investors in the future. There's a group called In-Q-Tel, which is actually the intelligence agency's investment arm. They will invest in you, but they require all this weird stuff that's almost like a poison pill for other investors in the future. So there is a way to do it though. There's a company called Tosni, who I think is kind of representative of what you can do with government contracts. You'll literally see government contracts posted publicly. And what Tosni did is they said, we're going to grow slow and low. We don't care about a whole bunch of PR or anything else. We're just going to take government contracts and we're going to do an amazing job. And then we're going to live from contract to contract. And they're a couple of years along. So when, we're going to swing from it kind of vine to vine like Tarzan. And when one kind of winds down, we'll grab onto another one. You never get huge that way. And part of the reason is it's really hard to commercialize government tech in a lot of instances. Like, his famous example is, Isaac Tosni, who runs the company, says, oh, I had this idea when we were working on this, on this government contract, and it was for this multi-factor authentication that looked a lot like Cisco Duo, a company called Duo that was very popular. And he wasn't able to act on it because he was so, beholden onto this government contract, but also because your mentality becomes different. When you move and you just do contracts, like you become a little more risk averse, like it changes your logic and so forth because you can't see that immediate stream of income. So, it's not a great way to approach it. Yeah. All right. So OpenRaven, when we started, part of the idea behind the company was when I was at Tenable, every customer had the same problem that they didn't know where their assets were. Literally between the cloud, which is incredibly dynamic and ephemeral, they'd lost the grip on their data centers and everything else. Between Internet of Things and all the stuff that's inside a modern office and so forth, all the new connected devices. And then they had people who had wandered off the network who are working from crazy places. There aren't very many organizations today that can even tell you what their attack surface is, like what their assets are and so forth. So we started the company. We thought we were going to take on that problem, but we had to change. And I'm going to show you why. And thinking on category actually is the reason why and what caused us to pivot. And we thought about it fairly deeply. Hey, Arcy, I need you to enable sharing for me. Oh, there we go. Cool. All right. So what you're looking at here and is my analysis of the category and how we were thinking about it at that time. And after doing this, I came to the conclusion that if we stayed with our original plan, we were completely screwed. So this was part of the thought logic of focusing on data security instead of our original focus. So I made it pretty polished because I wanted to share it with people, because the more brain power you can get on this sort of decision, the more people you can force into their frontal lobe on this, the more horsepower, the better off you will be. So, this isn't something you do in isolation. It's a team sport. So you'll see up here, it says a company's choice of where to compete is almost 4 times more important than outperforming within its market. Once again, choosing your category and knowing where you compete, the playing field, way more important than how you execute inside it afterwards. It's really that critical. And if you want to get into, if this excites you for some weird reason, there's a book on it that takes you through the whole thing, and it's called Play Bigger. And the whole book takes you through different category kings, as they call them. I'll continue. So I started by saying, what's the problem we're solving? Like, define it. What job are we trying to do for customers? And here's a great example. Basically, depending on who you ask, people will tell you how much stuff you have. And at the end of the day, if you're the person responsible for protecting it and you don't even know how much stuff you have, your chances of actually defending it are pretty small. So I wrote all this out, and then I wrote out our intended solution, in a really kind of simple sort of, few paragraphs here. And then I said, okay, what's our approach is for what we're doing? And you'll notice that this sounds, really pretty consistent with what I said before. I left out the option of, I kind of reframed one of the options that I said previously, but I said try to shape and drive an emerging category or make a new category. And then, I set out some things and said, okay, well, we're not going to do things that aren't a security company, because between my co-founder and myself, we spent 25 years in the same industry. Like, to do something different would be a little crazy. So we're got to make sure it's in our wheelhouse and that we have an unfair advantage. And a lot of the startup life, what investors are looking for and what you want when you pick an idea and a problem to solve is you want to have an unfair advantage in it, something that other people don't have. And if we would have chosen something outside security, we would have totally given up our networks and all of our disproportionate advantages of having been there, done that in security. So we said, look, anything like that's off the table. And also, we're a startup. Hey, we're a well-funded startup. We've got plenty of money in the bank. We've raised a little over $19 million in a little over a year. Nonetheless, no science projects. Like, we have to express and satisfy a clear customer need in the short term. We don't have the money to take on a big, crazy gambit. We're not Elon Musk. We're not going to invent an ex Tesla or a Hyperloop. Like, let's just be clear about who we are and what we're doing. And, we want to take on a big problem, though. So, just because you're not building Hyperloop doesn't mean there aren't lots of other really important big problems. So we went into it, and then I just started going through, like, well, what are the categories we could go through? SIEM market, vulnerability management, cloud security. Okay, all right. What about refreshing an existing category? And I looked at it and said, there's nothing that we can kind of glom onto here that I love. And I went through a whole bunch of things here, and I started kind of naming categories and how I would refresh an existing category and then make a new category. And this was kind of my conclusion at the end of it. And basically, I said, at the moment when I did this, I said, we can do this. And then as the world goes in early stage in startups, I called my co-founder a couple weeks later. I said, dude, we can't do this. Like, this is not happening. And the reason why I said that is, it was going to be really hard. And there was another more interesting problem that came up. So I sat down one Sunday and said, what is the market telling us? Because we'd been interviewing people and talking through it. And part of the telltale sign that we weren't focused on the right thing was the conversations that were describing what we were doing. I should have been able to get in and done in about a minute. Like, literally, like, it should be that fast where I can tell someone, this is what it is, this is what we're going to do, and it goes. Like, remember, Kahneman, I should be able to hit your system one, have a gut reaction, and fit in the right spot. If it takes you 15 minutes, you have failed because you've made that person push into their frontal lobe and think about it. Their pupils have dilated and they will not like you. As humans, we don't like people that make us think that much. So product guy, long time, like if it takes you that long, it is a clear sign of failure. But an interesting thing had happened. And like I said, we're going to go fresh and funky here. I'm going to take you through the diary of a madman. So what I'll do is I'm going to take you through some of my documentation here. Here we are. And this is where I started thinking through, what have I heard? What are people really telling me? And I did this on a Sunday when everything was clear, crisp and clear. I had plenty of brain power. And I just started pouring through all of these notes from people and what they were telling us. And at the end of it, I started highlighting things. And I said, oh my God, the market is telling us we need to reinvent data security, because every time we talk to someone about their assets, they would say, oh, if you did that, then we could finally solve this nagging problem of we don't know where our data is and how it's protected. And the problem is, we should have heard this probably weeks beforehand, but you go in and you look at the world with such a narrative in your head and you're kind of listening for certain things. Sometimes it takes time for you out of the melee just to sit down and say, oh my God, this is what people were really saying. When you strip away your own narrative and you start listening to what they're saying, as opposed to listening to cues that kind of reaffirm your existing belief. And you can see me highlighting things and starting to get my head around who are the players. You can see I'm pulling stuff from analysts. Industry analysts are important in this, how they think about it. I'm writing down what I'm digesting from their websites. I interviewed a gentleman named Jeremy Whitcop here. I interviewed a person in the industry, and here's my co-founder. And you can see, hey, good, our architecture is definitely the right one. So again, team sport, we're kind of going through this. I interviewed an attorney, all sorts of different people in the market talking to customers themselves, and really just kind of kept hammering in my notes the whole time. And, I listened in on webinars from Gartner and other folks and just started plowing it in. And this ended up being, let's have fun. Let's see how many, we'll see how many pages this ended up being. But I interviewed one of the leaders at one of the companies that I wanted to displace. No better way to figure out how to beat them than to talk to them, right? So anyways, as you can see, all of this went into creating the category. And you'd think, wow, your work's kind of done. It's clear what you want to do. But the problem is, that's kind of just where the work begins. Then you have to distill all this raw thought down into something that's incredibly easy to digest. So let's see. There we go. And you're about to see a very pretty intro to a board deck. This is our Pride edition of our lovely raven named Bailey. So this was the most controversial and interesting slide of our board meeting yesterday. This is my distillation of our category fit. And the funny thing was, we had a ton of conversation on it, and certain people didn't agree. But the nice thing about having thought through it so deeply and done so much homework afterwards, I was able to say, okay, we'll take your feedback and your consideration, but I know I'm right. So, you can get a little too much help from the board at times, and you have to trust your gut. But what we do is we open up and we're very transparent about our decision making and the why and so forth. So here's how I distilled down our decision making on our category to our board. So first I said, if we're honest with ourselves, we sit at the intersection today of data of this CSPM, this Cloud Security Posture Management, and DLP category. And today we're selling to the cloud people. We're selling to the cloud security people. By the end of the year, because we don't quite fit in this DLP category yet, we'll claim that we're this new type of DLP. So this becomes, today, we're sort of an odd duck. We sort of fit in the CSPM category in here. It's just by virtue of where we are with building the product. And we are going, when we can credibly claim this, meaning when we can block things, that's when we're going to claim that we're actually a sexy new version of this data loss prevention thing that totally fits in the cloud. And today, the way that we get into someone's head and fill our slot is over here. We say, if you have a lot of data and you have a heavy cloud footprint, we're the best company for you. If you have a whole bunch of data and not a lot of cloud, you should just go with the existing DLP people. You might be okay with that. If you have a lot of cloud and maybe you've tried these products and they haven't worked for you with data security, we're a great choice. Come to us. And, you know, yeah, there's these guys over here, but they don't quite fit the bill. They were built for protecting Box.com and Salesforce and so forth. Like, we're focusing on protecting your core infrastructure, your data centers in the cloud. So that's a little bit of a window into the journey. And you can go to our website and see how we talk about it, which is meaningfully evolved over time from our launch until now. But, you know, basically, we had a long debate over this, and the board said, you know, oh, maybe DLP is too stinky. Like, people think of it in a certain way and nobody loves it. And, you know, we said, yes, you're right. That's a very real risk with this. I said, but let me counter that. When I talk to people, they have budgets for this DLP thing. They don't want to spend it on the old stuff. They want to do something new with it, but they have to check the box. Having an existing budget and saying, this is like that thing that you were going to buy, but it's actually new and better and hits the problem in a different way, allows me to tap into a budget at a time when there's a recession in the middle of a pandemic, when people aren't inclined to think hard about it. And it's way easier to borrow from that budget than it is to have someone spin up an entirely new budget or convince them that they need this entirely new thing. So that's kind of where we're heading and the journey we went across to get here. So with that, I'll stop sharing. I'll pause for questions, comments, and so on.
Does anyone have any questions? Don't be shy. We have a shy group, Dave. Snaps for them to not say very much. I mean, I think that what's really fascinating about that slide in your deck is that very often it's encouraged for a lot of startups to have that kind of slide, right, where it positions you against your competitors. I'm not sure if I've ever seen the kind of like XY one that you put on there so much. Is there like an advantage to the visual aspect of that type of a slide versus the one where you have your like traditional, like what types of services are provided checkboxes that, I don't know, I guess that's like my question is based on like why you chose those visuals as opposed to any other.
Yeah, you'll notice, I mean, let's go back to those visuals for a moment. And I want you guys to tell me what you notice about the slide and about the visual itself. And I'll ask a few very leading questions if you guys don't chime in. But what do you notice about this? What's, you know, first off, did I use like photorealistic images and things that are really sophisticated?
No.
Now, it's an advanced concept, but it's broken down into completely simplistic terms. I don't even use that many colors,
right?
Because what I'm after, I want to make it as accessible and easy for someone. I want them to look at it and say, ah, I get it, and I get it immediately. Again, without having to think that hard about it. And people are used to reading charts like this, and they also know what a Venn diagram is. This is not the place to get creative. You do not want to get creative and fresh and funky here. Like, we'll do that with the intro slide. Like, you know, we'll have our like multicolored raven there. Like, oh, this is nice, lean in moment. when you're trying to get across a really complex topic, the more twisted steel and sex appeal you throw at it, the more someone has to understand, the more someone has to grok something new. Oftentimes, the less interested they are because it's so much work. If I'm trying to sell you something, a concept, and trying to get you to fit me in a place, I want to make it as approachable and as easy psychologically as it can be. Where someone looks at it and says, oh, I know what a Venn diagram is. Oh, that's where you fit, right between DLP and CSPM, which I kind of know. Okay. And then I look over here and it's like, I understand charts. I understand bubble charts. I've seen this before. Oh, you're telling me you are more data in cloud than the other guys and you sit up at the top in the upper right, which I know to be good. Amazing. You don't have to read any of this text at the bottom, but for people who do want to go further, they can see it and they know that I've invited them into a deeper kind of conversation and more context by providing it. They probably won't read it, but that's okay. It's just another thing to inspire confidence that's there.
I guess
And then
oh no, sorry, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, and then what I do, and I do this for the board, I wouldn't do it for other people, is I bring in quotes from other people to say, and here's what people have told us in order to affirm this. And what's happening here is when you hear the voice of other people, immediately I'm saying, a lot of other people have told us this. I'm showing you a little bit. We've heard a groundswell of things, and people start nodding their heads and saying, oh, okay, it makes more sense. And I've already connected with a person. Images connect with people on a level that they're not really aware of all the time in their, in their conscious mind. So you've connected with them subconsciously in a very safe way for them by showing them things that are already there and made it easy for them to understand. And then you bolstered the credibility and the confidence people have in that decision they just made to trust you with this and to put you in that slot by sharing other people's voices. So you get that kind of wisdom of the crowd around it too.
My follow-up question actually dovetails that exact idea, which is, when you are interacting with these customers or with your competitors, when you're doing these interviews, pages and pages and pages, do you go in like with a template of questions that you use that are like considered good standard practice questions? Because I know it's kind of hard with some of the like issues with like founder bias and just kind of asking questions just to reinforce what you already believe. How do you approach those interviews?
I don't think there's like a set of questions. It's going to be highly situational, but there's no there's kind of two kind of wrong ways of doing it, and the answer is something in the middle. I think if you go in with a rigid set of questions and you just fire through it, you end up in the wrong place and you miss a lot of the cues where something will go kind of organically and what someone's really trying to tell you. If you go in with nothing, then you get dragged around wherever that person wants to take you. To me, that happy medium is, what are the key things I want to learn from this person? Not what do I want them to tell me? That's where you get into bias. Like if I went in, if I was solely interested in what people want to tell me, we would have never moved off that initial doc that I showed you. And we would have been in a far less interesting space. And we might not have even done our Series A and gotten funded. We'd be talking to a completely different set of customers, and marketing and everything would be different at this point. That door closed, and thank God it did. We're in a great plot. We're in a great spot. But what you have to do in my mind is know what you want to get out of it and know like the 2 or 3 key things you want to ask. But the great interviewers, like an Oprah, honestly, like she doesn't read off a script. She tries to connect with a person emotionally and ask things. She creates safety, and then she asks things that are kind of unsafe as well. And for those of you who listen to like the Tim Ferriss podcast, he does a great job of this, but he researches his head off for his podcast beforehand, or his other people do it. And he asks really good questions. But his podcast will famously go anywhere from like 45 minutes to 2 hours and 45 minutes, purely dependent upon the organic flow of the conversation. So the other like trick to it is I don't type it while I'm talking to the person. If you're typing, you're not listening. I take old school notes, pen and paper, because writing it down helps me commit it to memory. And then when I transcribe it back, I own it. I intellectually own that feedback at that point and I can bring it up later. And that creates mastery.
How long did it take you to get good at that? Because I'm sure it was something that you were just good at from the beginning.
I'm still not sure I'm good at it. I don't understand it. Like, if you're thinking like it took him a year to figure all this crap out and he had to get all that input, like, that's a fair critique. But look, I'd say my thinking in the past 10 years has really crystallized on this. You know, yeah, it's been, a decade of building products and kind of feeling my way through it. And then I decided to go to Norton and Symantec where I could learn to build stuff at scale. And then after I did that, I went out to CrowdStrike and said, okay, forget that noise. Let's go try and take their customers and do something small again. And, and I just kind of done it rinse and repeat, a few times since then. And that's kind of solidified it. Yeah.
How about when it comes to convincing? So, like this idea that Norton, or these other security software programs were meant to just put out like fires occasionally, and there wasn't kind of a consistent maintaining of security. Is there some like way to approach people who aren't necessarily doing something? And then you're saying, well, you should be doing this with regularity. I mean, my guess is that you'd have a little bit of pushback because it's something, like there's kind of the frustrating thing about startups entering enterprise is that like, if it's not broke, don't fix it mentality. Like so long as things are still operating, then it can't be all that bad. And so asking them to do more is asking them to do everything in their mind.
Yeah.
Approach a situation like that.
You got to convince them at a really visceral level that there's an easier way to do it. You can't just be better. It's, in my head, when I'm kind of vetting a product idea, I'm a pretty harsh critic. I'm a natural optimist, but when it comes to looking at product ideas, I turn on full skepticism, and I have to look at it and say, if a person was incredibly lazy and just wanted to keep doing the same thing, would they buy when I'm pitching to them? Like, would it matter? How would they say no? And until you've convinced yourself that a self-interested, lazy, unmotivated person would be compelled, it's probably not good enough. And look, with OpenRaven, what we've done recently is we said, God, you've got like all these breaches. We know you're worried and you don't know where your data is. We've got a platform we'll give you for free. Like, we'll deploy it and we'll give it to you for free. Wasn't good enough. Might it have been good enough if it was inside a pandemic? If it wasn't inside a pandemic and a recession, maybe. So what we did is we looked at it and said, okay, like, look, let's be honest. Like, there's too much friction and there's not enough value. So what do we need to do? Reduce the friction, and we need to increase the value. So what does that look like? Here's a new pitch. Look, we know this is hard for you. We're basically going to give you a service where we help you manage your cloud data security for the summer for free. And if it's super useful to you, we'll keep doing it and you pay us. If it's not useful for you, you can keep using the free version if you want. All of a sudden, people lean in. You mean you're going to do it for me for a while? Yes, we will. And that's starting to get people over it. Oh, and you're going to do this in the platform, which is something that I've always wanted to do, but I couldn't afford it, or it just sucked when I tried to do it before. Oh, so it's this constant kind of calibration, but you have to be brutally honest. And I fired my sales leader about 3 weeks ago. Why? Because he'd come in and say, well, everything's awesome and we have all this momentum and things are going well. When we dug into it, it wasn't. And what was happening is the learning loop that needed to happen, where we looked at it and said, you know what, guys, this is too much friction and not enough value. That's so essential to the business. And you have to constantly kind of tune it until you get to the point where someone says, okay, that's better. And thank you. And let's go, and then you've got a shot. But like, far too often, it isn't tested by fire, and those feedback loops take too long. And I'll tell you, like, I invested in a company that should have been successful, and it was a massive failure. Why? because they weren't nearly aggressive enough with making sure that there was clear value there. That test of like, is this better for someone than doing nothing? It failed out every time, but they didn't pay attention to that signal. Like, that signal is the most important thing you can pay attention to.
Yeah, there's so much to be said about friction, and identifying it, and being honest with yourself when it's there, because you can probably come up with plenty of excuses as to why that friction is there, other than it has something to do with what you're putting out.
Yeah. Yeah. It would have been super easy for us to say, hey, this is just the pandemic and the recession, and it'll come around. It's like, you can't accept that. You can't accept that as an excuse. You have to look at it and say, you know what, honestly, it might, but it might not. How do I get this to the point to where the person can't say no? To where it's so much easier than what they're doing right now, and so much better that they can't say no. And, I think that's no less than what it takes, particularly in this environment here, which is where people are so distracted, and so, what do you do when you're in a crisis? You go limbic, you really don't want to think, in that situation. You don't want to change behaviors. That project you might want to take, you're not going to take it on, for the very good reason that you've got more important things to worry about. The world doesn't make sense anymore. We hold on to our habits. Right. So if you want someone to build a new habit, you've got to tap into a cue that they already have, and then change the routine inside it and keep the reward at the end. There's a good book by a guy named Duhigg who talks about habits and how companies tap into those, and great stories about things outside of security, like Febreze and Tony Dungy, and how Tony Dungy kept failing but finally got like a team to the Super Bowl, and how he did it by changing people's habits. I'm reading it right now because I think we have to be incredibly, as a startup, as a company who's even trying to play inside an existing category, refresh it. You have to be that aggressive with people, and that scientific about testing and making sure that, you're tapping into an existing habits that's there and just changing the routine inside it. And it is a really high bar, and you've got to be hard on yourself, and you got to be hard on your team. And for us, that meant, having a really honest conversation with our board yesterday, and having honest conversations with ourselves, swapping out our sales leader, and other things.
That's tough. There are two more things that I wanted to say. One of them was the poll. We have about 5 more minutes left on the Zoom. Sometimes we go over, so that's perfectly fine. But I was wondering if you wanted to pose the poll questions to the group. No, maybe so. To me, it doesn't matter. There are these poll questions that we have. You know what? I'm gonna do it because we do it every storytelling, and I'd like to just get their answers. Okay, guys, get ready. I'm launching this poll. The first question is, based on everything that you were listening to today with Dave, what do you think is usually the path of least resistance? And so the answers are join an existing product category, refresh or disrupt an existing category, or invent a new category. Don't you all answer at once? Boy, you guys are sleepy today. Next question, according to you, which is the best example of a category refresh strategy? Oh, here we go. We're getting some answers. Last question is, what do you think is most likely to happen if you don't claim a product category? So while you guys are answering those poll questions, the other thing I was going to mention, just talking about behavioral friction, I brought this up at Founder Circle once because someone had brought oranges to the garage from like a tree at their house. This was back in the before time when we were actually around each other. And they sat in the kitchen untouched for half a week. And I know from experience that there is a ton of behavioral friction when it comes to oranges. You have to peel them, and like peeling them is so, distasteful or whatever. So I sliced them all up one morning and put 2 signs up next to them about all of the benefits of vitamin C and oranges in general. And I put them on a plate right by the sink where everybody gets their coffee. And literally within 30 minutes, 8 oranges were eaten up completely by everybody at the garage, and it was on a Friday. So during Founder Circle, I brought it up and I said, you know, it's a perfect example of how if you just eliminate behavioral friction, how quickly people will do the thing you want them to do, but you really have to understand what's keeping them from doing it. I could have made a bunch of assumptions about you guys not liking oranges or, you know, maybe just not being hungry. But at the end of the day, once they were completely served and ready for you and you had incentives, you just ate all the oranges. And so we had a big laugh about that. But there's enough can't be said about that. Okay, I'm gonna close the poll now and share the results. All right, what do you think, Dave? Did we pass?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's kind of, to some of these, there's kind of no right answers except for number 3. I mean, for number 3, the clear answer, and everyone got this, is like, people are going to give this to you anyways. Like, they're going to put you in a slot in their head. You're either going to claim it and be intentional about it, or it's going to happen. You know, these other folks will influence it. With respect to category refresh, honestly, I was just curious to hear what you all would
hear what everybody said.
It's a matter of opinion. A fair amount of these are a matter of opinion, whether you're refreshing or a total new category. I think face masks are kind of you could argue that it's a refresh or that it's a whole new category because these companies and products never existed and it's satisfying a different need that people had before. You know, same thing with iPhone. I'll tell you, like, I think it's primarily a refresh of the smartphone category and what BlackBerry had started, but you could argue that it's entirely new because of the App Store concept and everything else. So it's a matter of kind of subjective opinion. Number 1 is what everyone answered, I think is absolutely the right answer, which is, look, it's almost easier always just to build a better mousetrap. But I'll tell you, sometimes existing categories are so noisy, there's no way to get above the fray. Or there's sort of a natural oligopoly where there's only ever like 2 or 3 players and it gets stuck. So, you know, I think that's the right answer like 90% of the time.
Well, thank you. We're right about the end of our time. Dave, really quick question. You know, we have undergraduate and graduate engineering students here with us. Do you have any like pieces of advice for them, just something they can take away on if they were at all interested in, you know, getting into security specifically as a pathway? What kind of practical advice could you give them?
Learn the industry. And part of the reason I do a podcast called Security Voices is so you can hear the voices of people inside the industry, important folks you might not otherwise get to hear. Go hear their voices, hear about the problems they solve and how they think, and see if it's of interest to you, you know, and if that excites you. And we've got, you know, all sorts of peoples of different walks of life and solving different problems, researchers and CISOs and investors on there. Like, you know, check it out and see what you think. There's no advertising or anything on it. This is just part of my my parting package to the security industry, is to throw it out there. And I think it's, you know, there's others too. There's one by a guy named Jack Rhysider who does a really nice job, way better than we do, of kind of highlighting the dark side of the security industry. It's very like NPR-like. It's awesome. But yeah, I think take advantage of podcasts that are out there. Ours at securityvoices.org or, you know, or one of the other ones. Cool.
Great.
All right.
For having
Thanks,
me.
everyone.
Thanks for coming. Bye, everybody. See you Friday.